coming up on Dialogue Weekend. With no end in sight to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Finnish leaders on Thursday announced their support for Finland to join NATO. How will the conflict evolve, and how will NATO bids change the security landscape of Europe? Ferdinand Marcos Jr, the son of the former president, won the Philippine presidential election on Wednesday. What challenges will the new government face, and what does it mean for the Asia-Pacific? Now, on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xi Jinping. Finland's leaders have announced that the country should apply to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization without delay. What new dynamic will that bring to the ongoing war in Ukraine? And how will Russia react? To discuss the security situation in Europe and more, I'm glad to be joined by Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy of Tsinghua University, Harvey Zoldan, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian defense analyst. So Pavel, I want to start with you. So what's the response from Moscow so far?
Well, the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Kremlin have already officially reacted. They have condemned it as a destabilizing move, and it was announced that Russia will take measures, military, technical measures, and other measures to counter the possible threat. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, in particular, he spelled out that the measure of the Russian response will depend on what actually happens after the formal accession of Finland, because Finland is much more important for Russia geographically and strategically than Sweden. What happens? Will there be new military infrastructure appearing on Finnish territory? Will there be American NATO bases there with long-range missiles, possibly targeting deep into Russia or not? And so the Russian response will be measured on that.
Well, Pavel, if you look at this, membership of Finland, possibly Sweden, so what does that mean to the West and to NATO? And will the membership of Finland and Sweden somehow will harden or perpetuate this kind of tension between European countries or the West with Russia?
Well, both Finland and Sweden have formidable militaries. Sweden also has a formidable defense industry. They have been closely cooperating with NATO for a long time. Now they are kind of moving into the club. That's important, especially for Scandinavian countries, and in particular, say, for the Secretary General Stoltenberg, who's Norwegian. And I have seen during the years how Norwegians were agitating for Sweden and Finland to join NATO because they believe it's wrong that the Scandinavian bloc of countries divided, some neutral, some inside NATO. They always tend to be trying to be all together in one kind, politically, economically, militarily, and so on. And now that's happening. I think the Norwegians will be rather happy, and Stoltenberg is obviously happy. And that changes, of course, the balance of power somewhat in the north. There's the possibility of swift appearance, say, of NATO forces on Finnish territory, very close to St. Petersburg, to very important Russian bases in Karelia and in general in the north, in the Arkhangelsk Oblast. So that's important. That makes NATO stronger, and that's a serious problem for Russia.
Well, Harvey, obviously, as Pavel said, this will make NATO stronger, and Finland, Sweden, and other probably possible candidates feel safer, let's say. But is there a risk, let's say, because of the membership of increasing number of the countries, will that kind of like harden or perpetuate this tension between the European countries or between the West with Moscow?
Yeah, I think it will definitely do that. But I think that this should have been built into Russia's calculations when they were deciding whether to do this special military operation or not. But of course, Russia feels threatened they felt threatened for many decades now, and historically as well at times. So, of course, it hardens their position. And I think what worries me is that they'll take more riskier provocations. I mean, President Putin has been talking for a long time now about some special weapons. I think he means nuclear weapons. And there's a lot of speculation that he might fire off one tactical nuclear weapon somewhere, probably in Ukraine. And I think once you do that, a Pandora's box, a chamber of Pandora's box is further opened. And I think we come much closer to Armageddon. And I think this is something that we need to worry about and try to diffuse if it's at all possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joe Bo, sitting in Beijing as an outsider, look at this European situation. What do you see the impact of, probably more expansion, basically, of NATO, the eastward expansion, let's say, to include Finland and Sweden, closer to Russia?
Well, to answer your question briefly, I would argue that the more countries joining NATO, that means the more popular NATO becomes, the more insecure Europe will be. Of course, this is the choice of sovereign states as to whether they wish to join NATO or not. But you've got to think about this against the bigger picture, that is the security of Europe. Historically speaking, well, the security of Europe can only be arranged between Russia and NATO, right? That was in the past. Right now, it is also this situation. I actually read an opinion written by former Finnish Prime Minister Alexander Stubb. He actually argued that unless and until we had this war, Finland would not want to join NATO. That is true, but he also mentioned something which I disagree, because he mentioned that during Cold War, Finland was neutral. And so my question is, if during the Cold War, with all the tension, Finland could be neutral, and Russia didn't attack Finland, why now should Finland be worried of an invasion from Russia? Doesn't make sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting point here. I know you recently penned an opinion piece for The Economist, in which you mentioned about these similarities between the ongoing Ukraine war with the Afghan war in the 1980s. The U.S. supported the Mujahideen with weapons, endless weapons, and then the former Soviet Union was basically bogged down over there. So tell us more about that, and also if this is still similar in terms of purpose from Washington to basically weaken or isolate Russia.
Yeah, I think, well, I cannot say for sure that Washington wants to do this, but apparently so far Washington is the biggest winner. They actually could make the best use of this opportunity to unite all the NATO countries to promote this democracy versus autocracy rhetoric, and actually to ask all those countries that haven't paid 2% GDP to fulfill the dues. So as a result, NATO is strengthened, the Trans-Atlantic Alliance is strengthened. Talking about Afghanistan, because I believe that it is very difficult for Ukraine to accept Donbas being occupied by Russians forever. And Russia could not afford to lose, in Donbas, because Russia's all-out war in Ukraine has failed. So Putin definitely needs a sort of victory. And where can it be? It can only be Donbas. The question is, of course, I believe with the overwhelming strength of Russia, it can actually take over Donbas. But the question is, how can it garrison it? So the West definitely will send the endless arm, as it is doing now, to bog down Russia and exhaust Russia, as it did in the 1980s in Afghanistan. So we will see a re-emergence of the same scenario in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pavel, in Moscow, what do you think is the long-term goal of Moscow in Ukraine here?
Well, actually, I would call it, if we're talking about also Finland, it's Finlandization of Ukraine. because Finland, of course, was kind of formally neutral and independent nation, but basically it was under a Russian protectorate. It had a capitalist system, very thriving and getting a lot of money trading with Russia, but militarily and politically, they knew that Moscow decides for them all the major issues. That's why Finns are not so, Russians remember that period as very good for Russia and Finland. The Finns are a bit different. They don't like to remember the times of the Cold War, and so they are not really that happy to see that continuing. And with Ukraine, I mean, Russia would want to see a neutral, pro-Russian Ukraine that would not be a threat, that would be, in military sense, would be listening what Russia says, with no Western infrastructure, no Western weapons on Ukrainian soil, and Russia guaranteeing that Ukraine is friendly forever and neutral and or friendly country, maybe joining eventually with Russia, but not anytime soon. But Ukraine has other ideas, and Ukrainians apparently are ready to fight for that, and that is a very big problem. Right now, we have a stalemate of sorts on the battlefield, Ukrainians advancing north of Kharkov very slowly. Russians advancing in the Donbass also very slowly. Not much fighting, I mean, hand to hand, mostly artillery duels, not much or at all use of air force. But this lull won't last. There's going to be a very vigorous summer campaign coming up, in which both sides will be going for ultimate results. The Russians want to defeat decisively the Ukrainian military and change the kind of balance there in Ukraine. Ukrainians want to defeat the Russian military with Western help. And so we're going to see a very serious escalation and clash of big forces in Ukraine in the summer.
Mm-hmm. Well, Harvey, obviously for the European countries, in particular, the countries that are not in the vicinity of Russia, for example, France, Germany, Italy, they talk about still diplomacy or live or coexist with Russia, let's say. It's a bit different from the goal of Washington, where you have this Secretary of Defense publicly said that the goal of Washington is to weaken Russia, to defeat Russia.
I think that there is a divergence of opinion if you look at it on a country by country basis, but I think we're at a very interesting point in history. The EU is evolving from a bunch of member states, and with the exception perhaps of Hungary, is becoming more and more single-minded. So while the EU is hoping for a quick ending, I don't think either side is expecting that, because for now, the US and EU interests align. But if the war drags on into the fall and winter, as it may well, interests may diverge, as the EU is much more affected by energy shortages than the US. But with the exception of Hungary, I think that the EU is becoming more and more together, and looking forward to a time when its model may be more like the United States of Europe and the United States of America. And I think that what's happening now is that we can maybe see the initial thoughts about a more muscular EU security force or army. And I believe that this is President Putin's doing because he's scared people in Europe, no matter whether they're more developed, less developed, geographically close or not. And I think that's why we're seeing a degree of union that we haven't seen much before.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joe Boy, if you look at the, obviously on the European side, for example, the foreign minister for Germany basically said that they will reduce their reliance on Russian oil and gas to zero and forever. It's strong determination. At the same time, you cannot do it like in a short period of time. And in Washington, there's also the political will, basically, to share intelligence with the Ukrainians and the support with militarily, economically, to probably fight as long as possible to weaken Russia. What is the the ending scenario for you?
Well, that's really, really difficult for me to say, because we actually have read all possibilities. So mostly people talk about this war being a protracted war, well, a war of attrition, because President Putin certainly would want a few things basic for him. That is a recognition by Ukraine formally of Russia's annexation of Crimea, recognition of the two republics, and Ukraine never joining NATO. That is easy. But for President Zelensky to recognize the two republics being part, being the independent states, that's very difficult for him to swallow. You see, and with all the military support from the West, how long this war will last, we really don't know. So the question actually is what Putin might be doing if a quick victory cannot be achieved. So are we really talking about a nuclear attack by Putin? Because President Putin seems to have a reputation, quote, reputation of doing what he has warned in the past. You see, he is a man, according to what I read from Foreign Policy today, he actually, this actually is what Stephen Walter said, that basically he means what he said, you see, judging from what he did in the past. So he has more than once warned about kind of nuclear attack. Would he do it or not? He might be bluffing, but what if he doesn't? That's a problem.
Pavel, I want to have your input here. So do you think Moscow or people in Russia are preparing for the worst scenario, since there's no quick victory, obviously, worst scenario being, say, like the use of nuclear weapons or probably tactical weapons?
Well, use of nuclear, of this conflict going nuclear, well, there is it's a possibility, of course, but not very imminent. And I don't see a real possibility of it being, of any nuclear weapons being actually used on Ukrainian territory, because it's too close to Russia. There's not really the targets there that require nuclear weapons, and say, I don't know, wiping out Kiev together with the Orthodox Christian churches there that are seen in all of Russia as the cradle of Russian Christianity. I mean, no, that and the fallout, it's too close. I mean, the fallout will get most likely to Russian territory too, as it did from Chernobyl. I mean, I was in Moscow when there was Chernobyl, and in our institute, we couldn't stop work because there was too much radioactivity around. We couldn't use radioactive tracers for our biological research. So, I mean, it's not against Ukraine. I mean, if there's going to be any demonstrative use of nuclear weapons, it would be somewhere in the North Atlantic or Mid-Atlantic or North Sea, somewhere where it won't really harm anyone, but to show the West that Russia is a kind of in serious business.
Mm-hmm. That's a bit of relief, let's say. Thank you, gentlemen. We will continue move on to the next topic about the Philippines. And there's a new election over there. With the majority of votes counted, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. becomes the new Philippine president-elect. So who is Marcos Jr. and what will be on his agenda as a president? In this part, I'm also joined by Herman Laura, founder of the Philippine BRICS Strategic Studies Group, a think tank on the Philippines in global affairs. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. To start off, Dr. Laura, who is Marcos Jr. and what made him stand out from other candidates in this election?
Well, Bongbong Marcos for short, that's the fun nickname the people have for Ferdinand Romualdez Marcos Jr. His youngish looks and slight build may fool some people, but it's hiding really a very mature politician molded by several generations of political forebears who have been through, the entire family has been through turbulent times, turbulent histories. And personally, Bongbong Marcos, with his family, has been through a lot of tribulations, wrongly pilloried, abducted to Hawaii, uh, persecuted and prosecuted in the United States and the rest of the world, and of course in the Philippines. But finally, they have survived all these, and the revival of the Marcos legacy is now at hand. BBM, for short, Bongbong Marcos, has a unique quality of responding to hostility and aggression with equanimity, maintaining his calm and amiable demeanor through thick and thin. And I think the Filipino people viewing this found a strange new type of politician who refuses to thrive on mudslinging and rudeness. And when the 30 years of the failure of the Yellow Revolution dawned on the people and left the people with disillusionment over failed promises, people gave an ear again to the Marcoses and to Bongbong Marcos. But the real power behind the comeback of Bongbong Marcos is the rage of the people at the failed promises of the Colored Revolution, that is the Yellow Revolution of 1986, sponsored by the United States and other elite segments of Philippine society, and in fact defended by the United States with their F-16s in 1989.
Okay. So, Mr. Laura, yes, we will touch upon obviously his relationship with the United States, his possible foreign policy with China, etc. But right now, we have a president-elect, Marcos Jr. What are his priorities, both internally and externally?
Well, immediately, I think what is very clear is that he will continue the legacy from his late father, Ferdinand Marcos, of infrastructure development. BBM has also said that he's going to give priority to the small and medium-scale industries with tax cuts and so on, which I think we are learning from China also. In the domestic sphere, he has challenges to face. There are domestic vested interests that are very powerful. He will have to balance and juggle all these. But on external relations, I'd like to recall for everybody the photos of Bongbong Marcos as an 18-year-old with Chairman Mao Zedong on the right and First Lady Imelda Marcos to the left. I think these experiences enhances his understanding of this particular special relationship between China and the Philippines. All these historic experiences and subsequent warm relations between China and the Marcos family and the Philippines will not fail to inspire BBM to further the relations.
Well, Joe Boy, I wonder, how Beijing looks at this, new election, the president upcoming here, Marcos Jr. And there were reports calling him like a pro-Beijing or somehow disappointment for Washington. But anyway, he's the president of the Philippines, and he will be pro-Philippine, right? And the top priority is the interest of the Philippines.
That is absolutely correct, because I believe that with his election, of course, there is a kind of a sense of relief here in Beijing, because his position is quite similar to his predecessor, Duterte, who is at least by and large friendly toward China. But I believe that what you're talking about is the interest of Philippines is more true, because the truth is, the International Maritime Tribunal's ruling is unfavorable with China. So in that regard, the Philippines actually has already become a beneficiary of the ruling. But if the Philippines insist on that, that would not work without the cooperation of China. So his best strategy, I believe, he's just trying to strike a balance. That is, he's not eradicating the agreements with the United States. He left all those agreements still intact, while stressing on friendship with China, because he knows unless and until he could cooperate with China, especially in terms of his concern of fishermen's rights in the waters, for example, of Scarborough, Island. So he cannot manage. So this might be said to be best strategy, or this might be said to be his a innate friendship because of his parents' friendship with China. So it's a bit of everything, but it's very well balanced.
So Dr. Laura, speak of this South China Sea issue, the dispute between China and the Philippines. And Marcos Jr. Did say that he will seek agreement with the Chinese side and putting aside this, I think, believe it 2016, this arbitrary ruling over there. And at the same time, many people say militarily will also strike a balance by maintaining, if not strengthening, the relationship with the United States. Is that the case?
Well, I think incoming President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has made public statements that are very clear. He has said that the arbitration ruling was not attended, or the procedure was not attended by China, and being unilateral and arbitrary, it is not going to figure in any important way in this discussion. So I think that is very clear. He is not balancing. He is just being very correct about the interpretation of the arbitration panel's significance. He does have to balance in public the statements because of pressures from domestic, what we call boys, American boys. And that is, of course, a continuing challenge, but he is, unlike Duterte, very acerbic against the Americans, very openly hostile. He will be much more polite, but I think he is as firm as Duterte in maintaining an independent foreign policy, equidistance between China and the US, which is already saying, US, lay off your hands from our policies, and we want to treat all other countries as friends and deal with every country as an equal.
Well, the United States is going to have a special summit with ASEAN leaders, possibly including that of the Philippines over there. And it's reportedly Washington is going to sell this idea of Indo-Pacific economic framework. Obviously, it is not TPP. It's not a free trade agreement, and it's not going to include China. Obviously, it's going to welcome the participation of ASEAN countries, or countries in this region, Japan, South Korea, maybe Australia. So it's many people see that as part of the efforts to counter the rise of China, if not to contain the rise of China. Predict how successful it will be.
I don't think it's going to be very successful because everyone has to follow their national interest. And the United States national interests overlap sometimes with the Asian countries, and sometimes it doesn't. And you put another overlay on top of that America is almost dysfunctional at the moment. It's dysfunctional because although President Biden has a clear vision, he doesn't have a command of Congress. And he's likely to lose his tenuous hold on the Congress in a few months. And what's even more compelling is that somebody like President Trump could be elected in just a little bit over 2 years, and then it's all bets are off. So I think the U.S. is pretty much zero-summed out of making any progress, although they're certainly going to try, but I don't think they're going to be successful. And if they are, it's only in the very short term.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Jinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.